Thanks for tuning in to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm okay. I actually had to eat a couple Girl Scout cookies.
Oh, dude, yeah, good for you. All right, what's your favorite Girl Scout cookie?
Well, this is a debate in the household. Mine, I have two. I like the Caramel Delights because I'm a toasted coconut guy. And then what are the peanut butter patty ones called?
Those are my favorite. With the chocolate all around them and the tag-alongs?
Yeah, they're death.
I will eat an entire box and feel terrible.
And feel terrible. Feel terrible. 100%.
If another box is open, I'll eat another box. I love those.
We do too. Dee bought two of them. My God, I just throw my wife's name around on this podcast all the time. I'm like, Dee.
Well, I have a Dee in my house. My middle son is Dee, and he just called me right before we got on. He's stuck in an elevator.
Oh, no.
Yeah. It's like, someone's going to take the stairs in the future. He's like, yeah, you bet I am. I said, so how can I help you? He said, do I push this button that has the phone on it? Like, yeah, push that button.
Yeah. Push any button. Yeah. Push them all. There is unlikely a button that says drop.
Or eject, for that matter.
Come on. Yeah, eject. Exactly. Exactly.
I love that our children reach out to us when there's no possible way I can help them.
It actually is sweet. It's really sweet. Yeah.
This week, we get to talk about, it's actually, I don't do this very often, but it's two people. And the way that I set it up, which I think made sense, was to have Dr. Husk. So we're talking about Portland Public Schools, large district, and had some transitions. And so last year, Dr. Sandy Husk came in as the interim mid-year, and then she was replaced by Dr. Kim Armstrong this year as the bona fide soup. And so that's exciting. I think it made sense to bring them together and do this as a chronological sort of like addressing things to Sandy first because she started and then handed off to Kim Armstrong, who is now the superintendent. So I
love that setup. I loved it.
I thought it made sense.
Yeah. I'm really excited for people to hear both of them and get a sense of like, here's two people that have led this big district. And where do you see overlap? Where do you see differences in how they talk about leadership?
Yeah. From my own perspective, I thought to myself, I got to overlap with my predecessor because I was his assistant soup. So I got to know him and I knew where I was going. And for just a couple of months, he was bringing me in on decisions he typically would have made by himself. And when I left the superintendency, my successor came in, but we never shared space together. And I don't know, it kind of seemed like there was more interest in when you're gone, I'm going to lead. So we didn't talk that much. So this is going to be fun. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Enjoy our conversation with Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Husk. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools. Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guests are Dr. Kim Armstrong and Dr. Sandy Husk. And now this is an exciting episode because Dr. Husk was Portland, Oregon's interim superintendent last year, and Dr. Armstrong succeeded her as Portland superintendent. So welcome to both of you, Kim and Sandy. Welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
Likewise.
It is so nice to meet you both. And Dr. Husk, I was at last year's ASA convening of superintendents they do a joint thing, right, from Oregon, Alaska, and Washington. And as a WASA member, I saw you from across the room, but I didn't get a chance to introduce myself. So I'm glad truly that the universe has conspired to make that happen today. And if it's okay, actually, Sandy, I'd like to start our conversation with you because chronologically, I think it makes the most sense. You served as the interim superintendent of the Portland Public Schools until Dr. Armstrong assumed the role. And I was delighted to watch a conversation that you had with Christina Kishimoto of Voice for Equity, also a past guest on the podcast. The two of you talked about leadership. You talked about educational policy. You talked about creating equitable opportunities for students. And you talked about the necessity of strong collaboration between superintendents, educators, and communities that they serve. So my apologies for this long way of getting to my question, which is, Dr. Husk, the turnover rate for superintendents is really alarming in many areas of the country. And you've led diverse school systems through periods of transition. And so as superintendents take over their new posts, how can they balance staying true to their own personal leadership philosophy while also adapting to the needs and challenges of the districts they're about to serve?
I think what I learned over the 3/4 superintendencies, if you count the 6 months I did in Portland, is that really making sure that you can stay true to your values starts before you even decide to interview. That one of the things I always ask the executive search firm when they contact me about possibly being a candidate is to tell me about things that I can't find on the internet. And I typically start with, I want to know about each individual board member. I want to know what their passions are. What do they bring into the boardroom? What do they think about board governance if the executive search firm has gotten that far into it? And if there are any red flags at that point in time, that's what I then listen for during the interview, because I'm all about strong leadership, but I also understand that I report to a collective board, and it is their vote that then counts towards me moving forward and implementing that. One of the other things I like doing in the interview itself, I view the interview, and I say this kind of with a chuckle because I tell this to people applying for the first time all the time. It's like going on a date. You might have to go on a lot of dates to see where you have a right match between you and a board, but a date doesn't mean you have to get married. It does mean there's something about the relationship that interests you. So during the interview, when I'm getting a chance now to talk to the board, usually the first interview is confidential in executive session. I want them to know that it's really important to me to know what they're going to be holding me accountable for and what they're going to hold themselves accountable for, because that paves the way for knowing then which policies are important to have as a board district policy and which policies would be administrative policy. And I'm always coming up with silly examples. So to me, it's like somebody can say, I want you to bake a beautiful and the best tasting cake ever. And then they hand you the recipe. That means they're holding themselves accountable for the end result. Or if they say, describe, this is the measure of success for this fantastic cake, and we're looking for you to keep us informed on the progress towards that. So the analogy of the cake would be the analogy of student achievement. If I'm being held accountable, me and the district and the team, for increases in student achievement and graduation rate, then I want to know where is their line on what they're voting for in the boardroom versus having conversation about because they have deep interest, but they still see it as the executive responsibility versus the governance.
Gotcha. So in your metaphor of a cake, I mean, they may say, I want you to make the nicest cake. You come back with sweet potato pie. They say, you've made a pie, I wanted a cake. Whereas you're approaching this from, they want to see something delicious, something great for kids. You bring them sweet potato pie and they say, that's exactly what we're hoping for. But either way, you're hoping as you enter this relationship that there's a shared image of what you're actually going to be producing.
Yeah, and a shared image of it, and also real clarity on the accountability piece. Because I can have board members and community members that I disagree with and still be very supportive of their position, because I don't have to agree on everything, right? I used to say to family members, everybody gets to go in the booth and vote. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean we're going to convince the whole family to vote the same way, but we do have to be respectful of the different perspectives. And then my last comment in relationship to that is this is where listening becomes hugely critical. Listening during the interview, listening during your onboarding, and continually checking and coming back. Is this what I'm hearing? Am I hearing it correctly? That these are the priorities. So I just think it's setting the stage in the very beginning that we're going to have disagreements and we want them to be respectful and we want to be real sure what we're focused on.
That's interesting. You're also talking to really coming to terms with how do we want to be together, because there will be tension. And so if you've talked about that before you even get there, it will make for a stronger relationship. Yeah, Kim, I wonder if I could bring you in on this and ask you, since you've recently done this in Portland, is there anything that you would add to that advice?
Yeah, first, let me say I appreciate your words, Dr. Husk. And I've been thinking a lot about these last 7.5 months and onboarding in a superintendent. And I will tell you that there's 4 things that come to mind immediately. And the first is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So pace myself, value and see people and their brilliance, and really try and cultivate that. Trust the experience and the expertise that surrounds me, and be unapologetic about serving students and the communities that they're attached to. And I will say those are the 4 things that stand out to me the most right now.
So love those as sort of 4 guiding principles. First of all, the treat it as a marathon, not a sprint, is really that habits of system thinking of avoid the impulse to make a quick decision. And particularly when we become superintendents, particularly I imagine in a large system like Portland, you see things and you want to immediately inject yourself into a solution, knowing full well that a solution can only be achieved when it's done together. But boy, that impulse to make that decision is probably pretty strong. I'm curious about the value and see people, because I know certainly for a superintendent, there's the value of being seen. They want you to bless the good work that is happening. What does it look like? How does a superintendent show that they see people?
Yeah, I think it's really under the mantra of seeing people before the work, understanding the work that we have to do, understanding the objectives, and valuing the humans who are showing up every day, knowing who they are, understanding what they bring to the work, understanding their background, understanding the brilliance. We all, as humans, hold brilliance across a variety of things. And so it's really on me as a leader to know what that is for each of the members of my team. I think it also means feedback, investment, and just really spending time in getting to know individuals.
From what I've read about you, I sense that you are all about everybody picks up the broom. Nobody leads with their title. They lead as humans, and they have different jobs to do, but there's no hierarchy in terms of who's most important.
Absolutely. The way when our schools look at central office, they come to conclusions about, and so just knowing that services in our middle name, and that we want to be responsive. We want to make sure that everyone in the buildings, all of those who are supporting kids, have everything that they need. And so we need to be together as humans. We need to be well, right? We need to be in sync. We need to be informed. And I think all of those things are grounded in how we move as a collective.
If you're just joining us, our guests today are Doctors Kim Armstrong and Sandy Husk. Kim, you grew up in a military family. You became a second career teacher. Your path led you to 3 states, I read, culminating now, obviously, in Portland. And I listened to an interview with you where you expressed a commitment to uplifting teachers, students, and the broader community, and emphasizing the need to change negative narratives surrounding public education. That's certainly a rallying cry for so many of us right now. I know Shelley Berman, who resides in Oregon, talks about reclaiming the narrative, and all for that. He and Lavelle Brown are barnstorming the nation on this work. In the leadership model that I use to advise others, we highlight the power of language, and that can be metaphor and framing, scenario building. What are some ways that you're reclaiming the narrative on schools?
Yeah, Peter, listen, I was a kiddo that grew up in a low-income household. My mother was a single mother after my mother and father divorced, after my father's, military tour for about a decade. They separated and divorced. And so we were really impacted by that change in family structure, and then the ensuing impacts of poverty. So I had never been in a school K through 12 for more than 2 years consecutively. So lots of transition. The last time I remember staying in a family homeless shelter, I was 15 years old. So when we think about constants and those rocks, for me was a classroom. And knowing that classrooms have the ability to encourage or discourage really sat with me. When I was in 8th grade and it was time to make our plans for high school, I had a counselor tell me, after explaining to her that I wanted to be a medical doctor, that I needed to think of something more realistic. And I changed my mind and decided I would pursue a different passion. And I also remember about 10 years later where I would meet a teacher who would show me hope and love inside of a classroom and would dare me to think and imagine way beyond my circumstance. And so those were two pivotal moments. And of course, an encourager, one a discourager, but the power that exists inside of a classroom. Teaching is such a sacred profession, and we have to do everything we can to protect it.
You've just done that. I mean, one could say, teachers are the most important thing. Look at Hattie's research on the effectiveness of teachers. It's got an effect size of 1.4 or whatever. But you told a story. That story is so obviously one that you've told before, and it almost comes out as if you've told it for the first time, that you're speaking so from the heart. And I really am grateful for your story and for being able to share it with others. Sandy, how have you... Obviously, I've heard the use of power of language to communicate your goals to a community. I imagine you do that in a similar complementary way. How do you use language?
I would, first of all, the reason that I'm able to do it is because my thinking is fairly simple. I like to say I'm not the smartest person in the room, but I can make things pretty clear. And Kim is a master at communication. So I love hearing her story as well. One of the things I think you have to do is you really have to think about not what do you want to say. You'll get to that in a minute, but you have to think about who am I communicating with? What do they know? What do they want to know? What do they need to know? So that I can find a way. It's actually like educating, right? You wouldn't start teaching a third grader more complex reading text without finding out already if they can read simple reading text. So you have to get closer to them. We tend to forget that when we're interacting with adults. We tend to think, if I tell the whole community that bilingual education is good, and here are the reasons it's good, that they're going to love it. And the truth is people don't love it. So I have to find something that hooks more. Some people, I shouldn't say people don't. Some people don't. Some people
I was a bilingual Spanish teacher. I loved it, but I think I was a particular crowd. But yes, no, I hear what you're saying. Look, I was a superintendent in mid-Missouri. And so there was, when I said, wouldn't it be great if we had a bilingual, dual immersion program here? And the first question was like, wait, what? Yes, meet people where they are. It makes total sense.
And Kim and I've talked about this too during the transition time, but she's facing a huge budget challenge right now. Guadalupe and I tried to tee it up for her by making some cuts last year. She's now in the second round of those. Back in 2009, when I was in Salem Kaiser, that's all I was talking about, unfortunately, because of the Great Recession. And 2010 was when the cuts were going to need to be made. And I realized that when people hear school district budgets, the dollar amounts are so overwhelming, they immediately assume if you have a $150 million budget, you don't have any problems at all. So you have to take those dollar amounts and you have to hook it to something that they can experience. So I would try to hook it to your own household income. And I did my little fingers of five. First, you spend down your reserves, you stop your large purchases, you do some symbolic reduction, and then you're into people. And when I go through that, talking about school districts' budgets, I can say, and this is your savings account. That's what a reserve is, and put it in perspective with numbers that they can relate to, right? If you make $80,000 a year, you have $10,000 in your savings account. Those kind of stories, I think, are ways that we can't change the negativity of what we're going through in tough budget times, but we can try to be clear and supportive of their angst and concern. And then the hardest thing that I think Kim does, I do, and lots of great leaders do, is to end it on an upbeat message. It's hard to say that we're eliminating 200 positions and then turn around and try to say something positive and upbeat, but we will, right? During the recession, our layoffs literally were close to 500 people. And the message I would end with is we will get through this. We will tighten our belts. We will get through this, and we will get through this in a way where we can still work with each other on the other side of the tough decision making, because then we'll need to rebuild confidence again so that the public wants to keep financially supporting public education.
That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to ask each of you a question that I ask any guest who comes on the program. And so, Sandy, we'll start with you if that's all right. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
I think it's the perfect description of what Kim said just a few minutes ago about valuing each individual, letting your team do the work. I always will tease the curriculum and instruction chief academic officer that I'm more inclined to give them input because I know what they're doing but I have to remember that they don't need me, that they're in that position because they're good at what they're doing, and I have to take on a different role. And then I could laugh and say the finance and the tech person are totally safe because I wouldn't be leaning in unless it's values or, public decision making. I think that when you recognize as a leader, at the Super Bowl, this is probably the best analogy possible. It's really all about the team and the goals, right? What's the vision for what's going to make this a strong organization? What are each of our roles? And how do we care enough about each other to confront when we feel like your imperfectness, which is absolutely valid, is interfering with the team's ability to work together? I think that kindness of confrontation can take a team a long way because you do it in a way that says, I want to understand you better so that I can be stronger when I'm interacting with you.
So may I turn to you, Kim? How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Yeah, I love the question, Peter. Speaking of the Super Bowl, there was a commercial, a Nike commercial, and I absolutely love their statement. You can't win, so win, right? And when I think of imperfect leader, I think of who we are as humans who approach the work and all our imperfections, all of the things that we carry with us, past trauma, past hurt, past disappointment, and the courage, the call, and the ability to lean into the conversation on improvement and success shines through. And so really it's, I think, an acknowledgement of we're a collection of people that have failed at various parts and times in our life, sometimes failing forward, sometimes not so much. And yet we're still called to serve anyway, right? We're still going to win on behalf of kids. One quick story I'll also share, as I often share with people, is about 15 years ago, 14 and a half years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. And it was during my first year as an assistant principal, right in the late fall. And I tell you, receiving the news was already overwhelming, but I knew that I would have to show up and do what I needed to do. If you know anyone that's ever been through a battle with cancer, you know that about week 6 or week 7, the daily radiation or the weekly chemo or sometimes daily chemo hits hard and you hit a wall. And you get to a point where you feel like, I'm just done. I'm not going to do this anymore. And I remember hitting that point in my cancer journey. And so I would go in every day for daily radiation, and I would have this nurse, you're in real quick, about 15 minutes, and they would ask questions and check in on you. And I remember she would ask questions. I would rattle off some things, never knowing that she would one day use those words against me or for me. And so one day I got to a point where I'm like, I can't go in. And she called me and I was like, yeah, I can't make it in today. She called me the next day and she repeated back all the things that I said to her about what I wanted to be true for me, for my family, and for my kids. And it was inspiring and motivating. And I got up and I put one foot in front of another. 14 years later, obviously I won that battle, but it's not the winning that I think most of. I think of that nurse who had the courage to collect information, knowing that she would have to speak to me one day in ways that motivated me. And then the action that she demonstrated, the love that she showed was every bit a leader to me and will always be. I mean, it saved my life. And so really in that call and that action, when I think of what it means to lead and be imperfect while doing so, it's about leading with love. It's about collecting those funds of knowledge and that information about people and finding ways to inspire when they need it most. That's why I was attracted to the superintendency, and that's why I'm here in Portland.
What a powerful story.
Wow. Kim, thank you. Yeah, I was about to say, but she really came the closest to becoming that perfect leader. Boy, she was really listening and tending to you. It was amazing.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being. And I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of an imperfect leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, They shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. Our guests are Drs. Kim Armstrong and Sandy Husk. And Dr. Husk was Portland, Oregon's interim superintendent last year, and Dr. Armstrong succeeded her and is Portland superintendent now. In this segment, as we do each week, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they have made, and then we discuss it. And so we're going to start with Sandy. She's going to put together the whole theme for us and the scenario. We're going to ask her questions throughout the entire segment, and we're going to ask Kim to interject with her thoughts as we go through. So, Sandy, what happened?
I'll go back to what I shared in part 1, that during the recession, and I know everybody, depending on your state, your local situation, the year might have changed. But for us in Salem-Keizer, when we saw it coming in 2008, we purposefully waited until 2010 rather than having the painful reductions, serious reductions for 3 years in a row. And because we had the resources at the time to keep providing the academic support that the kids needed. So we did a long process with the administration, going through different scenarios and coming up with numbers, et cetera. And then I worked strongly primarily with the communications team to be the primary voice. But we also counted on our central office leaders being able to speak for the superintendent in most situations, and definitely our principals were huge in making sure that the community knew and understood what was going on. And I don't know that we made a lot of bad decisions, but there were places where I felt like we probably could have explained small school closures better, because people really don't like closing schools, and all of us understand that. But I'm not sure I really tapped into the emotion of what they were going through enough, because there was a lot of it. There were some moments where I wished I'd had a magic wand with some of our labor relations groups. For the most part, we were really able to work with each other on certification and trying to save every single position that we could. For instance, if a teacher was certified to teach Spanish and science, and the Spanish position was going away, could we find a science position for them somewhere else in the district so that we didn't have as many layoffs? We ended up having some, but not as many as we would have.
Yeah. So can I interrupt for a second? If I understand correctly, we're talking around 2010. So we're talking these ARA funds at that time, because I was a principal at that time, that we had some funds that became available through the federal government. And then some districts made poor decisions. And I was in one of those districts that decided to increase staffing at that time. And then all of a sudden in 2010, we were forced to make some significant cuts to staffing because there was no money for them anymore.
Yeah, then you're right about the ARA funds. And we had the same situation, but we didn't put it into people. No, this was literally just a reduction.
Okay. So in this case, you had this sort of infusion of potentially some federal funds that you were then deficit spending, and now you had to make some significant changes. Yeah. And in terms of engaging the community around small school closures, that might have needed to be done differently. In terms of negotiations with your labor groups, those went as well as they possibly could. And then I imagine you made those cuts. So what would you have said was overlooked in the process?
Again, I don't know that it was a major overlooking, but I think once you get into the formal budget committee, which is the system that we use in Oregon for making announcements, it gets voted on by the board, and the board is a part of the budget committee. But once you get into the budget committee process, people are now reacting to what is being proposed, instead of possibly spending a little bit more time talking about why we were going to have to live without certified librarians in middle and elementary, why we were going to have to close some elementary schools. It felt like the amount of love and care that you were feeling for people didn't always come off in the confusion of the discussion and the decision making.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kim, as you're listening to the experience from 2010, superintendents across the nation are now having to go through very similar types of experiences. I mean, either they had many years of budgets that they were deficit spending. They had an infusion of ESSER funds in this case, and those got spent down. And it's now time for communities to because of growth and the models that exist at the state level for funding are also complicating things. So I'm curious, the approach that you're taking right now, would you maybe just describe how you're bringing in your community and having these conversations in a very public way?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. I will tell you that I initially had some plans on how we would talk to community about our originally agreed upon number of about 40 million. We thought that there would be a rise in the governor's budget and that we would benefit by having about half of that. So my original, I would say, engagement plan was pretty low level. Well, about in November, we heard that our public employees retirement system, our PERS account, would bring in about $32 million that we need to find. So obviously that means adding to our deficit. So when I was originally thinking, we'll have 40 million and then we'll see what the bump is with the governor. And we had some predictions that was probably going to mean that we would only be reducing about 20 million. We found ourselves in November looking at about 72. And so through some PERS investments and with the recommendation from the governor for the current service level, we were actually able to get that number back down to 40. But remember, initially, I thought that it would be about half that. So what we needed to do through December and January was really pivot and build a robust community engagement plan, lead out with our proposed reductions, and then do a series of town halls so that we can engage individuals about what the outlook was looking like and what the proposed reductions would be. And so there was definitely a winter pivot that we needed to prepare ourselves to get through. And all this happening while our new CFO wasn't starting until January 6th.
Oh my. What are you learning about relationships right now, Kim, as you are in this new role and you're trying to build relationships at a time where you want to leverage relationships, yet you're still forming them. So what are you learning about relationships?
Yeah, remember those 4 key things I talked about?
I do.
Marathon, not a sprint. Seeing people, understanding expertise and experience, and being unapologetic about students and the communities they are attached to. I will say those 4 lessons came as a result of where we were this winter with the budget. I think one of the most important things is engaging community often. And I know sometimes there's this tendency to protect our staff and our community from, the current state of things, not because we want to hide things or not be transparent, but because we don't want people to, freak out or have meltdowns or believe that the sky is falling. But what me and the team decided was that our only course of action is to be clear about our current state, because we know that we needed our entire community, even the supporters of Portland adults who don't send their kids to school here. We need everyone out advocating for funds for our system, not just, but for the entire state of Oregon.
Dr. Avis Williams, who's superintendent in New Orleans, she said to me that what communities want isn't necessarily transparency. What they want is clarity. They don't need to know every bit of how you're making a decision, but they certainly want to know why you're making a decision. And it sounds like you're really working towards that. Sandy, when you heard me ask Kim about relationships, I'm curious what that sparked for you in terms of what you learned about relationships as you were making some really difficult decisions, not sold by yourself, but with your community.
Well, and this wasn't, 2010 wasn't the first time I faced some budget deficits. When I got Clarksville.
People don't associate you now because now, you had to deal with it in Portland too. Like, here comes Dr. Doom.
No, I don't think they'll say that.
I don't think so either.
When I was in Clarksville, my first superintendency, we only had it was a decent sized district, 6,000 kids, but I could get in front of all the employees in one room, right? By the time I got to Clarksville, I started realizing this was in Tennessee, and I was running a much larger district, like 3 times as big as that, actually more than that. Then I had to figure out a different way of building relationships, and it couldn't just be school visits. It's fun to do a school visit because you get to see everything in action, but it doesn't allow any conversation. So setting up representative groups of employees that I had regular direct interaction with, going to principals meetings, making sure you spend some time with principals one-on-one or in small groups whenever possible. I had a classified representative communication group that met monthly at noon, and we'd bring in pizza, and they all decided who the reps were, and the agenda was theirs. But it was a time for me to get to know them and to hear directly about their concerns and their goals and their dreams. And then, of course, with the certified teachers, we did the same. And those relationships, which I then replicated some of that structure when I got to Salem, those have to be started way in advance. So I love the sensitivity that you have to Kim's situation. Of course, she's been in Portland before. She has a great reputation. So it's not like she didn't come in with some relationships.
True. It's just different, as you both know.
Yeah.
When you've been the soup or not the soup, that just the title changes the relationship, even when you don't want it to. Those people you've worked with in the past, I'm just still Peter. I'm still Kim. I'm still Sandy. Yeah. But you're the soup now. And so it does change to some extent. My apologies for interrupting.
No, that's okay. The thing that Kim also said that I've experienced is you can handle the predicted problems, but when you get an unexpected $32 million bump or whatever she described, that's a very short window for trying to figure out now, this plan that I've been chewing on for 5 months. I was getting ready to execute, and now I have to, go back into not emergency response, but urgent response on how do we handle this and who do we need to have working with us. So I think you have to start early. And I often have said, Peter, what you just said, I'm taking my superintendent hat off in some of these employee communications. And my Sandy hat is saying, wonder if we can do this. But I make sure people know I'm not directing you. Once I say I'm taking that hat off, I'm now talking to you human to human. Work with me on this and see what we can learn together.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, particularly just sort of the act of doing that says, look, I want to explore this outside of the role for a moment. And so what could you have done differently?
I think it always helps. I had a friend who told me you should always try to look through the windshield, not the rearview mirror. And so he was talking specific to transitions from one job to another. But I think it also applies in some really tough decision-making that you're going through. The more you can stay connected with the vision instead of constantly second guess, you're going to have plenty of time to diagnose and second guess whether or not you could have done little things different, but in general, focusing forward. And I think really tough times of stress, budget cuts, somebody's sick and is having to go for treatment, it's harder to keep your heart and your head in the same place on that. And that's where your inner fortitude, and in my case, years and years of practice, as evidenced by the fact that I've been doing this so long, becomes more of a habit. But it's hard, and we just have to recognize it's hard.
Yeah. What does that make you think about, Kim?
I think of where we were at in December and early January when we were designing this engagement plan and realizing that we had a really short timeline to get the proposed draft of reductions out and then engage community about. And the team, everyone was so frustrated and thinking like, oh my goodness, we're going to get so much blowback. And, what's the boardroom going to look like? What will our union leaders say? And I will tell you, Peter, it's been absolutely amazing. Our PAT president came to the board meeting, thanked the team for leading out with information early. The mantra that we've adopted is early and often. We want information out early, and we're going to put it before people often. And we had not one public comment on the budget. No banners, no signs. And the news media seemed to really frame it in a way about informing and then pushing for advocacy down in Salem. Our goal is that the conversation not happen in our boardroom, but the hearing room in Salem. And people have really leaned into that call of action. And so I think what it's shown me and the team is that we can absolutely show up, put information out, and know that people are willing and ready to be in this with us.
Well, it really sounds like typically my question is, in the end, what was something that was good that came out of the situation? And what you're experiencing right now is the advocacy is being done, to your point, down at the state capitol, as opposed to within your own space and having people sort of eat each other, right? You're going to cut this, then why don't you cut that? Or why are we being cut if you haven't, cut that? And instead of, destructing from the inside, you're going, look, why don't we advocate, for each other down at the state level? Does that sound like what I think I heard?
That's absolutely right. Like, we have over 220 positions on our proposed list of reductions. We have significant amount coming out of classrooms. A class size adjustment was recommended. And even at the end of the day, the question that we're getting is, how can I help? Who do I need to be in touch with down in Salem? Not centering on the decisions that we needed to make here in central office.
I love that. And Sandy, I imagine that you feel pretty good hearing that, because no doubt you were trying to create that field that, sort of set the stage so that those kinds of conversations would take effect.
Well, and, really 6-month interim, I was handed a lot of the decision-making by the previous superintendent I mentioned earlier, Guadalupe, and then Kim and her team are just solid individuals. I mean, the amount of talent and leadership in the Portland community and MPPS was very positive. And so to have that energy and passion channeled to a place where you can use your voice for a difference in the future, as it has to be very satisfying. And I couldn't be happier hearing Kim describe that.
That's fantastic. I want to return to your situation and just sort of be able to close it out. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of your situation?
We still stayed focused on student achievement and graduation rate. We did not skip a beat. And that was, again, part of my analogy. We can tighten our belts for a couple of years. We can do it. And we can stay focused with, talent that we have and make sure kids benefit. And when you look at the numbers during that time, we did not skip a beat.
Kim, what advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
I love that question. I think I would say lead authentically, have the courage to use your voice and always do what's best for students and staff and the community that surrounds your district.
And Sandy, what would you say?
It's a really rewarding profession, and the kids really need you. And I would say be open enough. You are so much stronger, especially when you're in the very top leadership position. Be open to people telling you that they think you might be wrong. Create a consultancy in that cabinet room. And you don't have to agree with them, but you want to reward people when they tell you something that they didn't want to have to say to you. You want to say, thank you so much. I don't agree with you, but I really appreciate hearing it. You'll build strength when you are vulnerable and strong at the same time.
Peter, I have to go back to the Nike quote. I mean, it's so powerful when you think of it. I mean, of course, the imagery helped, but the idea that you can't win, so win, was just so powerful to me. It was the words that I needed at that time. There's many spaces that we're going to be in that we'll visit temporarily or that we live in for a long time where no matter what you do, you can't win. So you know what? You win anyway.
You're in the right state to be able to quote Nike as often as you want, because no other state in the nation, I think, can do that. Our guests today were Drs. Kim Armstrong and Sandy Husk. To both of you, I'm just so grateful for your time. I cannot wait to share with others your 4 pillars. It is a marathon, not a sprint. It is about valuing and seeing people. It's about trusting the experiences of others, and it's being unapologetic about what we do is for children. And Sandy, you said that children need us. It's never been harder to be any level of leader in education. And so more than ever, I'm grateful that the two of you are continuing to be a positive influence for so many out there. So thank you so much for your time. I really am grateful.
And it's worth it. It's a rewarding profession. It's great to meet you, Peter. Kim, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you too, Sandy. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. We are back, and we talked a lot in this conversation. I mean, this conversation had a lot around navigating transitions and talking about communication and engagement, values-driven leadership, and also this idea of, particularly right now, school districts across the nation are trying to figure out budgets and how to make decisions and how to do that well and how to engage people and how to make responsible choices, responsible with the community's money, as well as responsible for what do children need. And so I thought, really enjoyed my time with them.
I'm so glad.
I met them because of you. Like so often, I know folks. I met them through you.
Yeah. And to be honest, I only met Sandy the one time, and I don't know Kim. I don't know Dr. Armstrong. I know Portland Public very well. I've worked in Portland Public on and off my entire career. And I know Oregon quite well, and multiple districts within the state, but I didn't know Dr. Armstrong. But I really enjoyed listening to them, especially as they talked about how they approached leadership and the ways in which they were similar and different. I do have a question about that that Sandy says something up toward the beginning of the podcast of the interview where she says, is it all right if I quote the interview here?
Oh, please do.
She says, so you really want to make sure that you can stay true to your values, which starts before you even decide to interview. One of the things I always ask the executive search firm when they contact me about possibly being a candidate is to tell me about the things I can't find on the internet. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that was smart.
That's a good question.
And you know what? It also speaks to her level of confidence in herself and confidence in, sometimes we just were like, oh, I'm so glad that someone asked me to be interested in this job. And she's saying, look, I've learned that it's got to be a good fit for both community and leader. And so why don't we have some real talk about what's going on there?
Oh, I loved that. That got to her metaphor of it's like a date. You could go on a date, but you don't have to get married necessarily. And so we both have some interests here. Let's ask each other some questions. And it had me wondering, what questions should you be asking as you go into leadership? As in your first interviews, what are the questions that let's take her prompt and say, what can I?
Oh, I love that.
Do your homework, obviously, get ready. Yep. But what do you think you should ask? You're going to be assistant superintendent or a superintendent. They're saying, hey, we're really excited to have you.
So I really like your question. And I think I was recently called about a school district to ask if I was interested. So I actually thought about these questions more recently. And I think earlier in my career, I would have jumped to like, what's wrong? And in the question of like, tell me about the board, in the sense of like, tell me what's wrong with the board, as opposed to asking them, tell me about what you're really excited about in terms of the district, because that conversation will weave to, well, we believe this is what's exciting and we've got some challenges getting us there. So I can get to what's the real dirt. And this is the way I operate, because I also know that I can be so direct that can be problematic if I'm just like, so what's wrong? What's going, So, you want to know if there's an internal candidate. You want to know if there's, are they just doing this search to say that they're doing a national search, or are they doing a search because they really are looking for something different? And, I truly believe in trying to promote from within. So if they have good things happening and they have an assistant soup and it's been kind of part of their succession planning, I don't typically want to apply or even have the conversation, because I think it's just not the best service is being able to, keep building on what you were doing. That's the whole idea of passing that baton.
I think that there are leaders in public schools right now that are considering these roles, right? I mean, I think it even plays a role in moving from teacher to administrator. What are some of the best questions that you should be asking as you go into that role? One of the things that I found, and I was young, I was too young to even know to ask good questions, but I was so young that I was surprised that there was a world outside of the school system. I just assumed I was a teacher, and then those
are the questions you start to ask. Tell me about the community, right? And tell me about the community support, and tell me about what would proponents of the district say is going well, and what would opponents say that they'd like to change. So it starts to give you this idea of what's really happening. Yeah, the internal and external systems is often, you just don't know to even think about that stuff when you're first starting out.
And you're just in it. Like I know that Sandy even mentions this. She talks about that the C&I person, the curriculum and instruction person, is going to get constant feedback from her, but tech should be good.
And I love it. That was such a great bit of just total honesty, and something I think leaders need to hear, because I think they get into the role thinking they're supposed to be experts or at least competent in all these different areas. And they're not, nor should they be.
This is where I feel like maybe my biggest learning, and I think I've said this before in other episodes, that I no longer feel like I need to know everything. What I need to know how to do is ask a better question. So be able to say, I don't know what that is. What do I need to know about it? What do you know about it that would be helpful to me, do you think? Because I'm never going to know all those things. That's impossible. I just need to be better at listening and better at asking questions, which I will say, if I could basically show the thing that I just admired so much was Dr. Armstrong is on it, man. That woman is clear about her values, and they are rooted in listening and care for people.
Yeah. And they're rooted in experience. So it is truly at her core in terms of what she believes. I totally agree. I thought she was just a magnificent storyteller in crafting why you should care about education as an entire industry or as a field, why you should care about the children in her school district, and how you, even if you don't live there, want to be rooting for them and for the teachers who teach them. Yeah, I agree.
She said her 4 values were, it's a marathon, not a sprint. She said, so pace myself. She didn't say pace yourself. She said, pace myself. That's a self-reflective turn. Like, this is about me. This is what I value. She says, value and see people and their brilliance. Really try and cultivate trust. Cultivate trust. Note the experience and the expertise that surrounds me. And then last, be unapologetic about serving students in the community and the communities that they're attached to. I love these. I think that, yeah. What it made me think about it was like, well, Superintendent Stiepelman, what were the values that you held going into your first superintendency?
So mine are these Hebrew words, simcha, shalom, mitzvah, and tzedakah. And so first of all, simcha means joy, and that's actually my Hebrew name. And so I want to bring joy to others, and I also want to find joy in the work that I do. Tzedakah means justice. It's often associated with charity. And so to do the right thing for people and to really working towards a more just society. Mitzvah means good deeds. And so to do good, anytime you do something good for somebody, they say, oh, that's a mitzvah. And so just perpetually wanting to, follow for good and pursue good. And then shalom obviously means peace, right? And so just working for a peaceful world, a peace between factions that may have previously had tension and conflict, and just know that when we can bring each of those 4, tzedakah, simcha, shalom, and mitzvah together, that I just think good things happen for everybody. And so, yeah, those are my personal values that I hope are at the core of who I am, and then influence the systems I design, the patterns of behavior, and then the actions that I take.
We're not on video yet, but I'm just smiling like crazy, both in the. That's
sweet. And it's amazing because I did not know you were going to ask me that, but you can see it sits on my heart at all times.
Yeah. It's so easy for you to rattle off. I love it. I truly love it. I think this is why Kim's were so perfect, in that it's just who she is and what she cares about. And when she went on to describe
can I say something though about
love and brilliance of others. I'm sorry.
No, I spoke over you, and I wanted to say what Kim has prompted me to think about, particularly also because of the way you just asked that question, is those are my personal values. I need to sit down and in a journal or just quietly is to say, what does that mean for children? So, okay, that's what it means for you. What does it mean for the people that you lead or that you care about? Because I may have told you about the time where I brought values to a school district as a superintendent. And then when things were out of control, I said, well, we have these values. And they said, but those are your values. They're not our values. And we had to go through a whole process of actually, not had to, but it made no sense to have just personal values that I just assigned to the organization, but rather to say, what are our values? How do we want to be together? That's where the nested patterns of the leadership model comes from. Sort of like, how do we want to be together? And so 150 people in a room, teachers, kids, nutrition services, assistant principals, custodians, everybody. We were together and went through a really great process for establishing our values. And then over the next few months saying, and what does that mean? And I haven't done that for myself. What does that mean for children? I know what it means for me. What does it mean for children? I imagine you do this work with the work that you do on a daily basis with districts all over the country. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I do think your personal values matter in terms of clarity of people understanding what it is that you personally stand for. We say this to leaders in that if you're not clear or share what you value, not organizationally, not the organizational values. Those matter too. But I'm saying that if people don't know what you value, you'll make decisions and they won't understand why. This is huge. This is why disagreement works. Disagreement with a decision only works if they understand why you made the decision in the first place. Yeah. So that at least they could go, well, I don't think they should do it that way, but I can understand why he would do that.
It makes me think of even language learning. In language acquisition, there's item learning, where you learn how to say something, but you have no idea why you're saying it in that order. And system learning is when you fully understand why you're saying things. And so you're really speaking to item learning. I'll just do this because I've been told to do it, or system learning. I understand why we're doing this. And you can get to the conversation part of like, I may not have done it this way. I understand why we're doing it though.
That comment takes me right back to Dr. Armstrong's comment about understand the people around you and look for their brilliance, listen to their brilliance. Can I take us one more direction in this? I wanted to hear what you thought about the after action review in relation to budget cuts. I think it was timely, given where we are currently, to have this as a conversation point. And Sandy talked about this idea that, everything that we've already said, our personal values are clear. Our organizational values are clear. We are leading from a place of listening to the community, all of those things. And yet closing a school to everyone feels terrible. Everyone. What's the best way to navigate that? I don't know if I fully agreed. I didn't disagree. But I don't know if I would have gone with what Sandy said was like, be clear. Here's what's going to happen. She basically messages, we're all going to have to tighten our belts, but we'll get through this. And my thought was like, no, we won't. There's a whole group of people that won't get through this.
I was interested in we'll get through this. Where I landed was one must have great respect for your community, and your community must have great respect for you, that they trust you when you say that. You cannot be a new superintendent walking in saying, look, we're going to close the school and you know what? We're going to get through this. You really have to be able to sell that because they don't know you. One of my first interviews in the podcast in the first season, Tony Aylesworth, he is in Iowa and he talked about passing a bond and how he really urged his board not to move forward with it because he didn't know anyone in the community. They said, no, they know us. They'll do it. I mean, they didn't have a Long Island accent. So just reframe what I just said in a more Iowa accent. A more Midwest accent. What I thought was interesting was it passed by one vote. I mean, just one vote. So
I think that's so interesting.
So I thought there is a process for talking about budgets, and that is where you start early and that the cuts are not immediate, if that's at all possible. It sounds like for Portland, that's not possible. They're going to have to make significant cuts right now. And they had an impression they were going to get money from the state, and they did. However, the amount that they were going to need was, all it did was bring them back to their original premise of what they thought they were going to have to cut.
That was a part of that podcast. I was like, okay, hold on, let me track the numbers here.
Wasn't that amazing though? I mean, just like, let's say it's 40 million. Okay, but the state will give us 20, so we'll only have to figure out 20 million cuts. Yeah. So we'll do a 20. Oh,
but actually
everything's been sort of recalculated and so we got 20 million from the state, but we still have to cut 40 million.
Correct.
Your just heart hurts for kids because most of your budget is people.
Yeah.
So that just means program cuts. It means larger class sizes. It means fewer after school programs. It means childcare, all this sort of,
so much.
These moments of budgetary crisis do allow you to re-examine what is essential for us and what has been kind of important, but not necessary kind of thing. And so I'll go back to Sandy's, outline of, look, we're going to spend down our reserves first to a certain extent. I'm a little worried about that because you want that rainy day fund for when things go south. And so you don't want to put it off too long, but you'll say, look, we're going to deficit spend for a little while as we come up with our plan.
Yeah.
And then you're going to stop making large purchases. So if you were about to adopt a new curriculum, you're going to rethink whether or not you're going to spend that $150,000, $500,000 on materials and training, and whether or not it makes more sense to wait a little bit. Or new marching band uniforms, because those can be $75,000 just for one high school. I mean, they're all tailored to a certain extent. And so, so we're going to put off that because, our outfits look just fine. We're going to maybe implement some symbolic reductions. So things that people can see that they And then at the end, you've got to make some personnel cuts. And that's where you start looking at enrollments and maybe trying to creatively combine two classes or finding a way to leverage virtual learning so that a teacher at one school can be teaching kids at another school if it's a higher level language class and don't necessarily need to be in the room because kids are already pretty self-driven if they're in French 4 or AP French that's not required, but they're so super jazzed about. And so, we can't find 3 French teachers. We're going to do 1. And we're going to do this and the teacher will move around the district. Maybe this week I'm at this school. This week I'm at that school. And I think that's where that's an example of like innovation that isn't like exploding innovation. Like, oh my God, that's amazing. But it is just a different way of approaching. Like we want to provide opportunities for kids. Let's think of ways that we can do that.
I love it. Can I make one more comment about this that I think is interesting?
Yeah.
Gosh, this story is old. We have told the story of districts making massive budget cuts over and over and over.
It just cycles. Yep.
So here's my counter. How come there's never been a story of we have too much money, we don't know what to do with it? In fact, when people say don't
those
throw
districts
money
keep
at the
their
problem,
heads down, my friend.
Yeah.
They keep their heads down. There are some in some like lead mining town or the school district that's small enough but gets the railroad fees because the railroad goes through their town, so they get a fee every time a freight train goes through. I mean, there are districts that don't know what to do with all the money that they have, and they'll never tell you because they just keep their head.
This
down.
goes to like the thing that I wanted to say was like that when people tell me, well, we can't throw money at the problem, meaning public ed. My answer to that is we've never tried.
Yeah, well, because that's a really lazy, ill-informed, ignorant statement. Because what do you mean throw money at it? What does that mean? Because the moment you start paying teachers the same salaries as doctors and lawyers, you're going to continue to get even better teachers who don't think about like all the hours that they're spending because they know that they're being really well compensated. When you start investing in early childhood education for kids when they're born, infant, all the way to they're 5 years old, and even offer additional services to the kids 8 years old, families support, because those are big developmental years.
Right.
That's good money. That's good throwing money. Like you throw that money at those and watch society all together be lifted up.
Correct. I often say things like, well, if you give me the chance, we as educators, I think, would make some pretty amazing decisions and have some pretty amazing innovations that would be put into place. Would we mess up? Of course we would. We've never had that much money. Yeah.
But show me any other industry that isn't messing up and then get bailed out. So please, we're going to mess up. And I would say, and myself included, you said, I've never been asked as a teacher to make those kinds of decisions. You know what would happen if you allowed teachers to make some more of these decisions? Pretty amazing things. And we sometimes forget that as leaders. We're like, oh, look, I have this balcony view. I'm going to make these decisions. And I'll tell you, some of the best decisions I made were because they were generated and initiated and then championed by teachers.
Let's end on that idea, in the idea that, and this is now coming from the teacher in this podcast room right now, and that is that what if the budget conversation includes teachers, not just teachers unions? I mean, teachers thinking about families, thinking about where this could be, less about like the board deciding or the superintendent.
No,
deciding.
Totally agree. So right before the pandemic, we did something I thought was pretty marvelous. And that was having teachers, principals all come together and start looking at, here's what our budget is. This is, and anytime you add something, this is what it'll do to our reserves. And so then you either have to offset or be willing to deficit spend or find out. And it was pretty marvelous, those conversations, because then you got to really begin to see what does this group value more than anything else. So
love it.
All right. Well, this has been great. You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Jamie's laughing at me because I stumbled, but you won't hear it because I'm going to edit that out. Wah, wah, wah. Have a great week, Jamie. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, I'll see you next week, Peter.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be Imperfect Leaders, so join us next time for another episode on Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.